British Airways cuts 9,000 jobs and services and stops a pay rise. Labour's three rivals mix it at Blackpool. The TUC puts up its hands for unilateral disarmament. Poland's free union goes for free elections. And Kevin Keegan tells the England fans no excuses. Good evening. British Airways has told its workers that 9,000 jobs must go. BA says it's facing the worst financial crisis in its history. It's losing nearly £200 a minute. It wants to cut services, sell off planes, and close its cargo plane operations. The cuts were given to the staff in a special news sheet. 9,000 jobs to go by next June, a pay freeze until September next year, a 5% cut in passenger services this winter, 16 international passenger routes from Heathrow, Gatwick, Birmingham, Manchester and Prestwick to go by March next year. And if the internal island routes in Scotland can't be made profitable, a threat to end them. They're losing £5 million a year. The Secretary of State for Scotland, Mr. George Younger, said tonight he wants words on that. Ray Maloney went to see.
What makes these fierce cuts different is that British Airways made clear today they're going ahead, hopefully with, but if necessary, without the approval of the unions or anyone else. The airline admitted today it's been grossly overmanned, and the 9,000 jobs axed by next June, with those already gone, will mean a 25% cut from nearly 60,000 to just under 45,000 in 2 years. That's going to save about £120 million a year, at a time when the line forecasts losses of £100 million this year, on top of more than £140 million last year. Without them, the airline chief executive, Mr. Roy Watts, says British Airways, as we know it, will disappear.
I said today that unless we actually achieve the aims that are set out in this package, and I, in particular, shed staff to get down to 43,000 by May or June of next year, by the methods I have outlined, I will declare a compulsory redundancy in order to achieve the same.
British Airways staff knew that economies were on the way, but today's cuts came as a stunning blow.
Pretty shattering, really. I've been here 15 years, and I'm the wrong side of 50 to go and find another job. So I really don't know what's going to happen.
Well, I would imagine that there would be. The men would be quite upset about it, and they would put steps forward to stop it. Yes, I would imagine so. I mean, it's every man's living, isn't it?
The reaction is a bit sort of numb, really. That's how I feel about it at the moment, because we don't really know what's going to happen, do we?
The airline insisted today that after talks, the unions had listened and promised to go away and think about the proposals. But it was sure they would recognise them as inevitable in order to save the entire fleet. For the pilots, some of who've not worked, even though they had been paid for months, the view was one of resignation.
The airline productivity has increased while we've had a 7,000 reduction in staff. And that's been done by getting the cooperation of management and staff working together. So it's very disappointing that this happens without consultation with the staff.
More than 2,500 other jobs in industry ended today. They went at Bletchley in Buckinghamshire, Sutton Coalfield in the Midlands, Warrington, Hereford and Newport, and at Gosport in the Isle of Wight. 1,500 are going at Unigate's cooked ham factory in Bletchley, 500 at British Industrial Plastics at Sutton Coalfield, 350 at Coventry Climax forklift trucks at Warrington, 220 at Saunders Valve, chiefly at Hereford and Newport, and another 100 at Sanderson Wallpaper in Gosport. All the companies say they're making losses and losing their markets.
An audience chiefly favouring Mr. Benn heard the three rivals for Labour's deputy leadership in a debate at Blackpool tonight. They heard, as they expected, Mr. Benn and Mr. John Silkin say they want Britain out of the common market. Mr. Healy said he'd stay in. Mr. Benn opposed pay restraint. Mr. Healy defended pay restraint in the last Labour government. Mr. Silkin said he was a conciliator. Mr. Benn said he was the only candidate who'd voted for Mr. Foote in both ballots for the leadership. Mr. Healy said Mr. Benn had blackguarded the record of the Labour government he'd served in. The vote is 17 days away. From Blackpool, our political editor, Glyn Mathias.
This was an unprecedented occasion, 3 senior politicians bidding for the votes of trade unionists in the newly extended franchise for the party leadership. The trade union votes, with 40% of the Electoral College, are expected to be critical. The proceedings were scrupulously fair. The 3 drew lots to decide the order of speaking, and each got an equal chance at the questions from the audience. This is how the three candidates summed up their positions at the end.
That it would be a grave misreading of what's happening in the Labour Party to dismiss this great change that's occurring as the work of a handful of extremists living in bed-sitters up and down the country. That is simply not the case. It's that we've tried to make capitalism work with good and humane Labour governments, and we haven't succeeded because it can't work, because it rests on injustice, lives on inequalities, and if you try to modify them, then they turn on you and cut back your gains and throw you back to where you started.
That we shall never have the power to put our principles into practice unless we can win the support of hundreds, perhaps thousands times as many people outside this hall who are not as dedicated as we are, who don't share all our principles, but in a democracy have a right to put their view when the vote finally takes place. And we have got to be able to prove to those men and women, working men and women, the overwhelming majority of them, that our socialist principles means that they will achieve the objectives, jobs, low prices, which they hold most dear.
We can debate these things in friendship, in comradeship. We all of us want to. The thing that I sense here in this meeting tonight is the overwhelming mass of people here don't want to have an internal fight with one another. We want to work together. We want to do what we believe to be right, which is to get a Labour government. The reality is we have not yet got, as Michael said, the hearts and minds of our people. Let that be our job from this day forth. We haven't got much time, but I believe that working together, we can do it.
Mr. Benn said it had been a regular Labour Party meeting with genuine debate, and indeed it was. Mr. Benn got more than his fair share of the cheering, and Mr. Healy got more than his fair share of the catcalls. But the atmosphere wasn't as tense as it could have been, and the candidates even managed to agree on several issues. But on incomes policy, nuclear disarmament, the common market, there was fundamental disagreement. Above all, the debate highlighted Mr. Benn's commitment to take the democratisation of the party yet further, and Mr. Healy's total rejection of what he called this kind of ideological narcissism. Mr. Silkin rested his case on the claim that he was the best candidate to heal the party's wounds. Well, at the end, Giles Smith sought the reaction of some of the trade unionists in the audience.
I've put Ben about 70%. Silkin did very well.
I don't think it was a question of winning, but I was very impressed by John Silkin. I thought he was an articulate and very an honest man with great credibility.
Anyway, I don't think we were winners of the debate. It was a very interesting discussion. It was very interesting to hear in a dispassionate way, in a low-key way, the different points of view of the candidates. I do object, however, to some of the heckling that went on for one of the candidates.
Well, it was very good. It showed that there is debate possible in the party without any rancour.
But as far as the union's leadership is concerned, tonight's exercise was largely academic, because most of the big block votes have already been cast. On the first ballot, Mr. Healy has the almost certain support of 10 of the 24 biggest affiliated unions, with the second and third biggest, the engineers and the general workers, behind him, and a number of semi-large ones, the railwaymen, shop workers and communications workers. He looks like polling a total of 2,617,000 votes. For Mr. Benn, on the first ballot, are 9 unions, but they're generally smaller than Mr. Healy's. Only the building workers and Asdams can pull in more than 100,000 votes, and Mr. Benn's certain total on the first ballot looks like 576,000. Mr. Silkin seems to have only 2 certain unions, the seamen and the farm workers, giving him, again on the first ballot, a total of 100,000 votes. However, there are 3 unions, the miners, NUPE, and, most important of all, the biggest, the transport workers, who are still undecided. NUPE's 600,000 votes and the miners' 244,000 seem likely to go to Mr. Benn, which would bring his total to 1,420,000. The transport workers simply haven't made up their minds. Branch consultations so far indicate almost equal support for Benn and Healy, with only one of their 11 regions, Wales, swinging to Silkin. Their leaders would like to pledge their 1.25 million votes for Mr. Silkin on the first ballot. He's a member of theirs. But even if they did, making his total on the first ballot 1.35 million, he'd still be in third place. Assuming a similar pattern among MPs and the constituencies, he'd then be eliminated. So where do his votes go in the second ballot? Mr. Silkin's votes from the farm workers and seamen will certainly follow the T&G line. So the T&G decision on the second ballot will quite simply decide the election. If they go to Healy, his vote goes up to an unbeatable 3.96 million. But if they go to Ben, Mr. Healy's 2,617,000 votes are just overtaken by Mr. Ben's 2,770,000. The other possibility is that the transport workers will abstain on the second ballot. But my information tonight is that that is highly unlikely. And although nothing is sure, insiders in the union say Mr. Healy now has an outside chance of getting their backing, something would have seemed quite out of the question just a few days ago. And if he does get that backing, he's home and dry. Giles Smith, News at 10, Blackpool.
The TUC in its own business at Blackpool voted on a show of hands to close all nuclear bases in Britain, to ban the cruise Trident and neutron weapons from Europe, and to cut arms spending with compensation for workers who'd lose their jobs. That pleased Mr. Tony Benn, who emphasised his unilateralist policy in his debate against Mr. Healy. Mr. Healy told Mr. Benn strontium-90 was no respecter of conference resolutions. Also today, the TUC attacked biased and selective reporting by the media, expressing disgust at the misreporting of union issues. Our industrial correspondent, Michael Green, reports on the unilateralist victory.
The decision to adopt a unilateral stance undoubtedly marks a substantial swing to the left by Congress. Those in favour of Britain opting out of nuclear defence argued that we could not afford it, neither was retaining such a deterrent likely to help persuade others to disarm.
The only defence against nuclear weapons, and there is no other, is not to have them at all. And let's not mince our words here. This means we will disarm first. It does mean unilateralism.
At a time when the social fabric in this country is being destroyed, we in the trade union movement must rise and criticise and condemn the diversion of brains and finance into the most destructive industry known to mankind.
Well, that sparked off protests from two big unions that going unilateral would mean arguing for peace from an impossibly weak position, and that the switch would be an electoral liability.
Our aim must be to rid the whole world of nuclear weapons. I believe it follows that our attitude and tactics in relation to Britain's existing nuclear weapons should be determined by the effect that we can have on the world scene when we aim for general nuclear disarmament. I would remind you that in terms of being negotiators yourself, you never in fact go to a negotiating table and chuck away whatever muscle you've got out of the window before in fact presenting your case.
I don't believe that the British people will ever vote into power a political party which advocates that Britain should be defenceless and unable to play its role in the world politics.
But those warnings were ignored. The policy switch was agreed on a show of hands. The TUC will now add its weight to the campaign favoured by Mr. Benn and his supporters to commit the Labour Party to including unilateral disarmament in its election manifesto. Michael Green, News at 10, Blackpool.
The government made it clear tonight it won't be swayed by the TUC vote for unilateral disarmament. The Defence Secretary, Mr. John Nott, spoke to Tim Ewart.
Well, I think the outcome of the debate was predictable, but I'm nevertheless disappointed by it. First, because I'm sure it doesn't represent the views of the membership of the trades unions, because people in this country generally believe in keeping strong defences. And secondly, because nuclear weapons through NATO are the principal safeguard for peace, and a vote for unilateral disarmament is a vote not for peace at all, of course, but a vote for the opposite. You don't disarm if you're faced by a bully, you keep up your strength.
A coroner has praised the courage of a 14-year-old boy who killed a man attacking his father. Jamil Khalik was knocked to the ground by two men who tried to raid a shop in Manchester where his father was serving. But Jamil snatched a butcher's knife and stabbed one of the raiders in the back, killing him. The other raider fled. Jamil was charged with murder, but this was withdrawn on the instructions of the Director of Public Prosecutions. Today, the inquest jury returned a verdict of lawful killing. The coroner said it was quite reasonable for him to pick up the weapon and use it as he did.
A man has appeared in court charged with murdering a security guard shot dead outside a bank at Wadebridge in Cornwall yesterday. Malcolm James Edvian, an unemployed mechanic, was remanded in custody at Bodmin for a week.
Poland's free trade union, Solidarity, called for free elections at the end of the first stage of its National Congress in Gdansk. It also pledged to work to free Poles from misery, exploitation, lies and fear. Soviet anger at the demands coming from Gdansk reached a new pitch today with TASS, the Soviet news agency, saying the Congress had been an anti-Soviet orgy. Solidarity's leader, Lech Wałęsa, defeated 2 attempts to challenge him, as Nick Gowing reports.
They met in groups and the tactics were procedural. Hard-line radical delegates planning to force Lech Wałęsa's resignation as Solidarity leader. And behind the scenes here, delegation leaders had it laid on the line by Wałęsa himself why they need him and his experience. The radicals wanted to stop regional Solidarity leaders sitting on Solidarity's powerful National Commission, the main policy body led by Wałęsa. But Wałęsa, who showed the tension today, refuses to consider running a union without the big guns, the regional leaders, at the heart of policy making. Before the vote, an aide told me, I'm worried he could lose. But in true Wałęsa style, he called the bluff of the radicals. I'm the chairman still, he said, and I'll be the dictator. The vote was close, but Wałęsa survived just. Tonight they paraded the Solidarity banner after defying communist theory once more with the demand for free and democratic elections to Parliament. Another defiant demand to delete recognition of the leading role of the Communist Party was deferred.
But this isn't the end. Lech Wałęsa will face more challenges and there'll be more controversial policy decisions in the second half of the Congress due 2 weeks from now. Nick Gowing, News at 10 in Gdansk.
Now a war the world has gone rather quiet about. A special report from Jon Snow in Angola coming next. Plus, the Iron Lady meets a socialist ally. And England's captain says all he could say, no excuses. That's in a couple of minutes.
In Angola, a United Nations team is flying tomorrow to the war zone which South African troops recently invaded and where the Angolans say there are 130,000 refugees. The head of the UN team said today in Luanda that he would study the needs of the refugees and see how aid could be got to them. Any relief operation would be based on Lubango. Our reporter, Jon Snow, who's in Luanda, has been to a rally where a few Russians and Westerners were in evidence.
The purpose of the rally was to condemn South Africa's invasion, but it was too to introduce a new element, that of condemnation of America. The senior party official who addressed the crowd criticized America's failure to condemn South Africa's invasion. As the crowd shouted, "Death to Ronald Reagan," it was clear that his softer approach to South Africa has not improved Western influence here. By their inescapable prominence on the platform, there is no question about the scale of influence that the Eastern Bloc wields here. With around 4,000 East Germans and 4,000 Russians providing technical and military training, their numbers are not small. Behind them, the British, German, French and Italian diplomats wield less influence, but do represent the majority of trading interests upon which Angola is dependent. As the rally began to disperse, Angola's president, Eduardo dos Santos, was preparing to address journalists for the first time about the war in the south. And as if to counter South Africa's obsession with the Soviet presence here, he said everyone knew that there were technical and military advisors, but that neither East Germany nor Russia had any combat troops here. As for the Cubans, he said their numbers would reduce as Angola trained more men with whom to defend herself. The atmosphere here, even for rarely invited Western journalists, is very relaxed. Western diplomats based in Luanda tend to support the Angolan claim that Cubans and Russians are here more as guests than occupiers. In the meantime, Angola in particular, and Black Africa in general, is watching the way the West deals with South Africa in all this as a crucial test of their real intentions towards self-determination for all black people in Southern Africa. Jon Snow, News at 10, Luanda.
President Mitterrand of France and Mrs. Thatcher have had what officials call extremely good discussions at the opening of their two-day summit in London. Our diplomatic editor, Michael Brunson, reports.
Ministers and officials in Whitehall are actually excited about this visit, quite like the beginning of term, said one of them. Since it's not just the new French president who's here, but 6 new French ministers too, and the British government wants to find out what makes them all tick. So while M. Mitterrand and Mrs. Thatcher observe the customary ceremonial and deal with the main headings of the summit, French and British ministers have been getting down to things in considerable detail, and such subjects as the Channel Tunnel and Concorde have already been discussed, though no firm decisions have been reached about either. At Downing Street, the two leaders have already spent a couple of hours talking privately, though through an interpreter. A lot of that time was spent on world issues, and especially on relations with the Soviet Union, and on the reform of the common market, with both leaders probing each other's minds a little, ready for the battle ahead over the common market budget. Before dinner tonight, Mrs. Thatcher took M. Mitterrand off to the Albert Hall prom concert, where a French orchestra helped to sweeten the paths of diplomacy. So perhaps, in view of all today's talk about the Channel Tunnel, did the music they played? Or was it someone's private joke to have chosen Debussy's La Mer, the sea? Michael Brunson, News at 10, London.
Mrs. Thatcher has decided not to back a £2.75 million gas pipeline from the North Sea. It would have brought ashore gas now wasted in the oil fields because it's burnt off. Our political correspondent says the decision is a defeat for the Energy Secretary, Mr. David Howell. It's a victory for the Chancellor, Sir Geoffrey Howe. During 2 long meetings today, the Chancellor, backed by the Prime Minister, argued that the plan would dangerously increase government spending. Instead, ministers backed a much smaller scheme, a combination of new pipelines and existing ones. But our correspondent says it's far from clear that the oil companies will accept that. They've always insisted on big government help.
The second of the 2 young Northern Ireland policemen blown up by an IRA landmine in County Tyrone has been buried with full honours. Constable Mark Evans was 20. He died with Constable John Montgomery just 1 hour into his first day's duty as a policeman. The Bishop of Down and Dromore, the Right Reverend Robin Ames, said at the funeral in East Belfast, "What sort of a society can we look forward to if that society is built on blood?"
Lord Grade, the chairman of Associated Communications Corporation, that's the parent company of ATV, saw his shareholders today and said, "I still do the Charleston. Who the hell can lead a coup against me?" Derek Taylor went to the shareholders' meeting.
Lord Grade arrived for work this morning at 5:30, as usual. The sprightly 74-year-old workaholic is head and soul of the entertainment empire ACC, an empire in trouble since Lord Grade moved into the feature film business. With Raise the Titanic, the company ran aground and was left with a £7 million net loss. And the latest Muppets film, a dependably cheerful success, had to be mortgaged. Then last week came the news that Jack Gill, the number 2 at ACC, was to go. He'd been the methodical financial counterweight to Lord Grade's flair. So ACC shareholders came to today's yearly meeting with worries about the company's future. But there was little the average shareholder could do, because under the Independent Broadcasting Authority rules, over 99% of the shares carry no vote. Anyway, Lord Grade, bursting with confidence, fended off the questions. Waiting in the wings, though, is a man it's rumoured is contemplating a takeover. He's the Australian TV millionaire Robert Holmes Acorte, who suddenly acquired almost 30% of the shares. He refused to comment today. But in fact, he's powerless because he holds non-voting shares. But could that change? Well, 49% of shares in ATV, soon to be renamed Central Television, have got to be sold off by ACC on the IBA's orders. Lord Grady's hoping it might be politically unacceptable for a British TV company to fall into the hands of a foreigner, such as Mr. Acorte. So although he's got a tough battle ahead of him, it looks as though Lord Grade at the moment may well fulfill